Counsel, want to call your next witness?
Yes, Kurt Rhodes.
Good afternoon. Are you Kurt Rhodes?
Yes.
Welcome. Come on up. This is our witness stand here. When you get there, you can put your things down, remain standing, and raise your right hand. Be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you should give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your full legal name for the record.
Kurt Rhodes,
Please spell your first and last name for the court recording.
K-U-R-T-R-H-O-D-E-S.
Thank you so much.
Please have a seat. Mr. Rhodes, that microphone in front of you will adjust up or down, but it does not move back and forth. All right? Are you ready to proceed, sir?
Yes,
Counsel, you may.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Rhodes. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for asking. Can you please introduce yourselves, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and tell them where you work?
My name is Kurt Rhodes. I am a DNA analyst. I work in the BSO crime laboratory as a DNA analyst.
And what are the qualifications to be an analyst in the BSO crime lab for DNA?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Forensic Science from the University of Central Florida. I have completed the Sheriff's Office training program for DNA analysts. I hold certification from the ABC for American Board of Criminalistics and Molecular Biology. And I am required to complete at least 8 hours of continuing education per year.
And so how long have you been employed for the Sheriff's Office?
I began in 2004 as a DNA technician. I went into DNA training in 2005 and began DNA casework in 2007.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what's the difference between a DNA technician, like you were in 2005, and when you transitioned to 2004, and transitioned to 2005 to be the DNA trainee?
As a technician, I would do instrument maintenance, quality control checks on the chemicals and reagents, do ordering, record keeping, things of that nature.
So you briefly mentioned a little bit of your educational background. What types of coursework and classes did you take when you were getting your initial degree in the sciences?
The program that I did through the UCF was the DNA-based program for forensic science. So there was genetics, molecular biology, biochemistry. There was a statistics course, mainly the coursework towards the end of the degree requirements were mainly geared towards genetics and biochemistry and molecular biology.
So do you have specialized training using statistics to interpret DNA?
I have completed the statistics in my college coursework, and I have attended courses throughout my career in the Sheriff's Office dealing with statistics and how they relate to DNA casework.
You mentioned that you're required to do 8 hours of continuing education. Is that on a yearly basis?
Yes, perfect.
And approximately how many hours of continuing education have you completed since 2005 when you started your DNA training?
It's at least 8 hours. Some of the courses, use the term loosely, range from 8 hours to 40 hours. So 1 year maybe 8 hours, another year maybe 48 or even 60. It just depends on the year.
So in terms of the DNA section that you work for, what does it do on a day-to-day basis?
As a DNA analyst, I examine evidence that's submitted by investigators in attempts to develop DNA profiles from question samples and ultimately compare them to known standards to see if the individual that is being investigated or even alleged victim would be included or excluded from the evidence that's submitted.
In terms of the DNA analysis, do you do that yourself, hands-on?
I do.
And the training that you started to talk about, you said you started training in 2005. Could you talk and explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that training entails?
It entailed readings, hands-on processing of the samples that we did, time, extraction methods, quantitations. There was written tests as well as a mock court. Then there was it ended with a competency test to ensure that I was able to process samples appropriately, and then I was allowed to do supervised casework, and then finally independent casework.
So let's explain to ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what is a competency test?
A competency test is given to an analyst after they have completed a training program for whatever subject. It could be as simple as an extraction method or maybe a quantitation method. So the laboratory will then provide a test that the analyst would conduct. They would process this test and return the results to the agency to see if the results that they've gotten were appropriate for what was doing.
And do you have to pass these competency tests or examinations before moving on to the next steps?
The competency tests are done to ensure that you are competent in the technology that is going to be employed in casework.
So once you pass that initial testing, is there additional yearly or biannual proficiency testing then?
As a DNA analyst, I am required to do 2 proficiency tests per year. In our laboratory, the agency will purchase proficiency tests from a provider. I process them, generate my results, my answers, and those are then sent back to the provider to ensure that I'm getting the correct answers.
Are those done in-house in terms of the scoring and completion of that proficiency testing twice a year?
I process it in-house, it's reviewed, and then it's sent back to the test provider.
Does the proficiency test require and include statistical interpretations?
They do.
And has the statistical interpretations changed as the way they've been doing in the field of DNA over the last couple of years?
In my laboratory, yes. It went from statistical calculation with known as random match probabilities, single source samples, and CPIs, which were combined probability of inclusion. We've transitioned from those 2 methods to a likelihood ratio method.
And can you explain, in as simple of terms as possible, what is a likelihood ratio?
A likelihood ratio is a comparison of 2 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 compared against hypothesis 2. In terms of casework analysis, the initial hypothesis is that a person is included as a contributor to a sample, and the competing hypothesis is that the evidence or the DNA profile is coming from an unrelated unknown individual. So that is how the likelihood ratio is set up. Person 1 or person of interest is the contributor to the evidence versus it's coming from an unknown, unrelated individual.
Okay. So I want to go back, and so can you describe to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you're doing a DNA analysis, what is it that you're looking for?
For the analysis that I'm doing, I am processing for STRs, or short tandem repeats. These are small fragments of DNA that are located in our DNA genome. They repeat a certain number of times. When I first began DNA casework, I was processing 15 STRs plus the amelogenin or sex-determining marker, and now the technology has gone to 24 STRs.
So when you say short tandem repeat or STRs, do they code for something like eye color or hair color?
These are non-coding fragments of DNA.
Why is it important to look at those areas as opposed to iColor?
The locations that we're testing, or that I'm testing for, the locations that I'm processing, they're robust. They're polymorphic, meaning that there are differences. There's not just 1 or 2 variations. There could be 10 to 12 different variations, and they are independent from each other, meaning that the result that I get at location 1 will not affect the result that I would get at location 2, or the DNA profile at location 1 isn't affected by the DNA profile of location 2.
Is that a genetic marker? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And just so it's clear, can you define exactly what a genetic marker is from the DNA analyst perspective?
As it relates to what I do, it is the STL, the short tandem. That is the specific DNA fragment or DNA marker that I'm processing or testing for.
Can you explain what an allele is?
The allele is the genetic trait or characteristic. In terms of STRs, as I mentioned, they're short fragments of DNA that repeat. So they're measured in numbers. At location, I'm just going to say location 1, an allele or characteristic of gene may be a 7, or an 8, or a 9, or an 11. So a DNA profile that I generate is actually just a series of numbers based off of the alleles or traits that I obtain at each DNA location.
You said they're identified by numbers. What does that mean? Could you explain like where the numbers, what you said? Is it 274? Is it 11?
As I mentioned, the 7, 8, or 9, that refers to the number of repeats. So with the STRs, it's a repeated fragment of DNA, ATCG, and that ATCG may repeat a certain number of times. It may repeat 7 times, or 8 times, or 9 times. And so that is what those numbers that I'm expressing represent.
And where does that repeat? How does that show up in a person's individual DNA?
It is located on the DNA chromosome.
And what determines what makes up an individual's DNA chromosome?
In the case of humans, our DNA is inherited from our parents. We receive half of our DNA from our mother and half from our father. And with the exception of identical twins, no 2 individuals are going to share the exact same DNA.
In terms of your casework and the DNA process that you do, has that been validated?
Yes,
Is the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab accredited?
it is.
And by what outside accredited body?
We're accredited by ANAB, or the ANSI National Accreditation Board.
What's the purpose of maintaining an accreditation as a lab?
The accreditation is a voluntary process. The accrediting board will do an audit on our laboratory. It will check our SOPs, or standard operating procedures, to ensure that we are doing proper record keeping, we are following the procedures that we have in place, and that the laboratory is essentially running as it is supposed to be according to the SOPs.
And in terms of the specific areas in which the lab is accredited for, are you only talking on DNA?
It's accredited in 4 different sections: DNA, firearms, chemistry, and fingerprints.
Have you worked in any of those other sections?
I have not.
In terms of the proficiency testing that we talked about earlier, is that also part of the accreditation process?
Yes, everything that is done in the laboratory will be audited through the accrediting body.
And is there also accreditation and validation in terms of statistics that are used?
Again, it's part of the audit.
You mentioned that you used to do 15 areas plus antigen, and now you're at 24 areas. Can you explain what made that change occur?
The DNA analysis is a science, and as the years go on, the science advances. So the companies that provide these commercial kits are able to make combinations of these STRs in a bigger multiplex. That's what it's identified as, to analyze more DNA locations all at once in order to provide a better picture compared to years prior when it may have only been 9 locations.
With regards to the locations, does the software take into account the frequency then, or the amount of number of times a particular repeat is found in a population?
I'm not sure of your question.
And previously, when you were doing random population, random maps, or CPI, is it important to know how frequently a specific allele was shown up in a population of individuals?
Yes. At the end of the analysis, if I am, let me start over again. After I look at the evidentiary samples, I'll determine if it's a single source profile or a mixture, and then do a comparison to a known standard. If I am going to report that the known standard is included as a contributor, I am required to give a weight to this. And in order to give a weight to this match or inclusion, I am required to provide a statistical calculation. So years prior, as I mentioned, it was RNP or CPI. We've gone to glycolates now. But all of those different calculations or those statistics are based on allele frequencies. And what that means is those STR markers that I mentioned before occur in the population at different frequencies. So I mentioned allele 8 may occur at a frequency of 25% of the population has it. And allele 7 may occur at 15%. So when I do a statistical calculation with all of the alleles present in the DNA profile compared to the standard, all of those frequencies are used to calculate the end result, whether it's an LR, a CPI, or an RNP.
So while you change your method, you're still using a lot of the same and building on the same items that you've used in the past.
Yes, that's right.
Has the likelihood ratio, LR, been validated for statistical analysis?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury about how in the lab you prevent any sort of cross-contamination?
When I process evidence, I am processing one case at a time, and when I refer to that, screening evidence. So the initial step is to look at the evidence that I am receiving from our central evidence supply to ensure that the seals were intact. I will do an inventory of the evidence compared to the submission form and property receipt. Typically, the items are packaged all together in kind of like a big brown bag. I'll open that bag up and do an inventory. And then again, process one evidentiary sample at a time while leaving the other samples in a drawer or a cabinet.
What do you do in between each sample to your workstation?
And the workstation is cleaned with bleach and alcohol. As I'm doing my screening, I do wear a lab coat, gloves. I work in what's called a dead air box, a big plexiglass box about the size of this bench here. And I do all my processing on the bench. I'll clean that up after I'm done with the evidence, change my gloves, and then move on to the next piece of evidence. When the next step will be extraction, which would be after I've taken my sample and my cutting of this evidence, I place it into a tube and try and elute out or purify any DNA present that's on that sample. At that point, I'm working little test tubes. So I would, again, be changing gloves, wearing a lab coat, a mask, and I would only be working with one sample at a time, or only open it one sample at a time to avoid sample contamination.
In terms of, you mentioned the test tubes, are those sealed?
Yes.
So you talked about how you get evidence and it's brought to you. Does the lab assign a specific case number at the lab to track all items of evidence and samples?
Yes. When the investigator brings the evidence to the evidence window or the central receiving, there's a property receipt in the submission form. That's brought in, accepted by the evidence intake unit, and it is given a laboratory number.
When you receive evidence, you mentioned you check the seals. Why do you do that?
I check the seals. It's an indication if the evidence has been tampered with. There is a chain of custody form with property receipt, and it lists who had custody of the evidence, and then from which person to which person it's transferred to.
And where is the evidence stored before you go and retrieve it?
For the most times, it is stored in the evidence vault. There's some cases where the evidence intake unit keeps it up front in their area, in the safe, but the majority of times they have an evidence vault in which I go to retrieve the evidence.
So we've talked a lot about DNA and kind of the process leading up to that. What about serology? Is that a part of your job as well?
Serology is one of the first steps that I do when screening the evidence. With each case that's submitted, there's an evidence submission form. It gives me an idea of the type of evidence that I am going to be processing. Sexual assaults. Years prior, I would screen for semen, looking for sperm cells. Maybe the case has indications of blood, at which point I would do presumptive testing for blood. Items of evidence are submitted where the investigator is just looking for what's essentially called contact DNA, where an individual had come into contact with maybe an item left at the scene. There's no real serology to do on that one, but I would just take cuttings of the samples.
So, Mr. Rhodes, I want to make sure it's clear. Is it your job to go out and collect DNA evidence?
No, I do not do any of the collection. The evidence is submitted, and I retrieve it from the evidence vault.
Do you give any advice on where to collect evidence from?
I do not.
Have you ever been in training in crime scene or evidence collection?
I have not.
In terms of your employment at the sheriff's office, have you ever worked outside of the forensic DNA section?
I have not.
How many times approximately have you done the DNA analysis process we're going to talk about?
I was processing about 100 cases per year. I would say roughly 2 to 3 samples per case, so maybe 200-300 samples per year for a good 10 years. So thousands of samples in processing.
And in that time, have you had the opportunity to testify in court?
I've testified in Broward County about 40 times, and in the federal district 3 times.
Here, offer to defense for law matter?
No need, no objection.
Proceed, Counsel.
Okay, so I want to start with, in this particular case, did you do DNA analysis?
I didn't.
Could you please describe for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury the step-by-step process you go through? You started talking a little bit about extraction. You could pick up there and continue.
So again, the first step would be a screening of the evidence to collect my samples, which I would then put in 2 small, essentially test tubes, little microcentrifuge tubes. I would add reagents or chemicals to the tube in order to elute out any potential DNA that's present on the sample and to purify any DNA that may be present in that cutter.
Should we approach for just one moment?
Yes. Discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in the presence of person or research, just leave your note page on your chair. Thank you. Thank you. Let the record reflect the jury step down. Counsel remain along with the defendant. Our witness remains on the stand. Is everything all right?
Yeah, we just need a moment.
Okay. You need a restroom break, Mr. Demons? Yes? Can we arrange that for Mr. Demons, please?
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll be in recess. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could tell the witness why we're taking a break. That's your They were being loud.
We're in
and
recess.
I
talking.
object to this. They're telling you.
What is that?
I said no.
Oh, I thought you.
No, I said no.
This is just an example of interference for demonstrative purposes.
Could you like make some jokes while you're up here?
You ready?
One in the room. First one.
While we're waiting, I want to say that the BSO officers that are in this courtroom have been very cooperative and helpful, and I thank them all, except for Gary, of course.
Call the guy with the AC.
Again, Gary, over here, we think you're awesome.
That side of the table. This side, nah. I don't blame you.
This counsel and the assistant state attorneys, the jury's still in the jury room. I understand, counsel, I overheard you said you're going to use a demonstrative.
Yes, sir. I showed it to defense counsel already.
And I have no objection.
Thank you.
And you'll give that instruction on demonstrative evidence, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Seven.
Jury entering.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please be seated. Let the record once again reflect the presence of the jury, the defendants, members of the counsel, the assistant attorney, or witness remains on stand. And when we broke, I think counsel, you're going to be able to continue with your direct examination. Is that correct?
Correct, Your Honor. So,
You may proceed.
thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Okay, we talked about, you discussed what is extraction. Next, so is that, did you complete your discussion of what is the extraction step for DNA?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Extraction is when I'm trying to elute out and purify any potential DNA present in the samplings or cuttings that I've taken from the evidence. The next step would be quantitation, and that would be to determine how much DNA present, if any, is in the DNA extract, to then target a specific optimized amount of DNA for the amplification. Amplification is where I'm now going to be targeting those STRs, or those short tandem repeats, through a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, in order to make a detectable amount of DNA from that DNA extract, so that I could then go on to the last step of instrumentation, which is the detection phase using capillary electrophoresis.
So I'm going to go back and we talked about the PCRs, the polymerase chain reaction. Does that change the underlying DNA sample in any way?
It does not. It's simply there to make a amount of DNA that can be detectable on an instrument.
And why do you do that?
That is the basis for the DNA typing that I do.
And the PCR typing that you're talking about, how long has that been used?
That's been for several decades. It's used in mass disaster identifications, paternity testing, in the medical field.
How long has the process of DNA analysis and identification been used?
Again, it's been decades. STRs came around in the 90s, the middle to late 90s. So for 30 plus years, PCR has been employed.
It's been a little while since high school biology. Can you explain how DNA comes to be in an individual person?
As I mentioned, you receive half from your mother, half from your father. The woman has the egg, and the man has the spermatozoa. Each of those cells has half from each parent, and it combines to form the child.
So, is it always the first allele here always comes from mom, and the second one always comes from dad?
No. So the way that the allele table is organized is the smallest allele or number, comma the biggest allele number. I would only know which allele came from which parent by doing a comparison to the known parents. But there's things called recombination that take place during reproduction. So it's basically just a random sampling of the parents' DNA when those reproductive cells are formed to then make the offspring.
In terms of your DNA analysis, do you take into account siblings?
Siblings do come up from time to time. The best way would be to request a standard for comparison.
With regards to a sibling, or if you thought a sibling was involved, is that something you could tell from the data?
There is significant sharing between siblings. So if an analyst, myself, or any of my coworkers comes across a case where there is the potential that there could be a sibling, that information can be relayed to the investigator.
And I want to talk about, so it's clear, what is a standard when it comes to DNA?
A standard is a sample that's collected from a known individual. As I mentioned early on, the purpose of my analysis is to compare evidentiary or question samples collected at an alleged crime scene to a known standard or to a known person to see if that person is included or excluded as a contributor to any DNA left, again, at the potential scene.
In terms of how you're expressing your conclusion, are you expressing it in terms of it's more likely to be this individual than an unknown, unrelated individual?
Very similar, very close. I issue reports, and the wording is that the evidentiary sample is X times more likely to have originated from the person of interest than if it had originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. And when those samples become mixtures, then it becomes a little bit more wordy. That's the intent of it.
So going into, you talked about the unknowns and the standards. Is that relayed to you in some form when the evidence is presented to you?
Yes, it has to be.
Why is that important?
It's important so that I know exactly what evidence is questioned and what is a standard. The evidentiary samples are processed separately from the known samples to avoid any sort of contamination.
When you say separately, do you mean separate workstations, separate times? Can you define that for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury as to what you do to separate them?
I will process the question samples first, and then I do work in extraction batches. So several cases of question samples will be extracted, amplified, and put on the instrument together. And then I'll work a set of known samples, again, separate from the question samples, at different times and spaces.
Is it separate by days?
Not always, but there are chances, or there are times where it is separated by days, but it's definitely separated by time.
So the last step of the process that you were talking about, the capillary electrophoresis. What is that?
That is the step where I put the amplification product. I take a small portion of the amplification product, and inject it onto an instrument. And what that's doing is it applies an electric charge to this little liquid to essentially suck up the DNA that's present from that amplification. And it runs through a little thin, tiny straw, so you have a visual, a capillary. And the DNA fragments are separated by the size, because all of the STRs have to be detectable and they all can't be the same size. So as they migrate through this capillary or little tiny straw, there is a fluorescent tag that is present on each of these DNA fragments. A laser will excite that fluorescent tag, it emits light, and that light is captured. But again, the DNA fragments migrate or travel through that little capillary based on the size. The smaller ones will migrate faster, and the larger ones will migrate slower.
Is this captured in some sort of a chart or diagram that's then presented?
The samples are collected, and then they're analyzed through a program, and then I do have printouts. They're called electropharograms.
So with Your Honor's permission for a demonstrative as to what an electropharogram looks like.
Okay, is there any objection?
No objection.
All right, again, ladies and gentlemen, the witness will be using a demonstrative to assist in explaining or illustrating his testimony. Please remember that the testimony of the witness is the evidence. However, the demonstrative is not to be considered by you as evidence in the case unless it's later received in evidence, and it should not be used as a substitute for evidence. Only items of evidence received will be available to you for consideration during your deliberations. So at this time, this is not in evidence, it's demonstrative.
Mr. Rhodes, can you... May I interrupt? Mr. Rhodes, can you explain kind of what this chart is?
So this is an electropharogram. This is one of the pages. They're typically on 2 or 3 pages based on whether it's a single source or a mixture profile. As you see across the top, there's some red boxes. And
So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so it's easier to see.
there's these red boxes, and then you'll see a bunch of letters and numbers. To the left, you'll see D8S1179. That is one location that I am testing for. It's on the 8th chromosome. I would call it D8 for short. And as you go across to the right, you'll see D21 for short, D18 for short. And these are the locations, or these are the specific STRs that I'm analyzing.
In terms of you said it's a D8, is that the address of where this STR is located?
That's essentially what that is. It's the location on the chromosome, the 8th chromosome, and then the S1179 gives a more specific location on where it's located.
Can you describe that like in terms of a house address? If the address is 123 Main Street of a house, how would that you correspond that to what you're looking at here?
The best I can do is, again, it's on D8 would mean that's DNA on the 8th chromosome, and the S1179 gives a more specific location on that chromosome. Again, we have 23 chromosomes, so there are multiple chromosomes.
And do you test and sequence every single marker on every single chromosome when you're doing DNA analysis?
No, it is only the select set of STRs that is used for each specific commercial kit. And in this particular kit, I use what's called global filer.
And what is global filer?
This specific DNA kit used for these STRs.
And how many specific locations are you testing for in global filer?
There are 24.
So in terms of the specific evidence that you did in this case, I want to kind of just go in order with your reports, if that's okay. The items that were submitted to you and processed on that. I'm going to start with the lab number items 16 and 17. If you need to refer to your report.
Yes.
Okay, so items 16 and 17. Was there a description attached to those items?
There was.
And where do you get the description from?
The description comes from the property receipt as well as the evidence packaging.
If there is a discrepancy between the property receipt and the evidence packaging, do you note that?
Yes.
So starting with 16 and 17, what description were you given as to where that swab originated?
These are oral swabs coming from Cortlen Henry. Item 16 is the right side, and item 17 is the left side.
Do you test both of them?
I did not. I tested one.
Why don't you test both of them?
It's a buccal swab or oral swab coming from the same individual. There's not going to be a difference in DNA based off the left side of his cheek or the right side of his cheek.
So when you test item 16, can you explain to ladies and gentlemen in the jury how you go through that process?
It is, again, what I mentioned before. I would screen it, do an extraction, quantify it, do an amplification, and then develop the DNA profile and use it as a DNA standard for Mr. Henry.
Moving on to item number 18. Did you test in that particular item, develop a DNA profile?
I did.
And the DNA profile assigned to item number 18 was what?
It is a DNA spot card from Christopher Thomas.
And in terms of what is a DNA spot card?
It's a blood stain collection card taken from the medical examiner.
And as to item number 19, the next item, did you test and develop a DNA standard or profile from item 19?
I did.
And what was that?
It was a DNA spot card from Mr. Anthony Williams.
Going forward to item number 20, what was that?
It was identified as swab from water bottle, PM number 18.
Do you know where that water bottle was?
I do not.
Did you do the DNA analysis on that particular item?
I did, yes.
And can you explain what conclusions you drew on that item?
The DNA profile obtained from item number 20 was uninterpretable due to insufficient data.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what does it mean by insufficient data?
After I do the analysis of any DNA product, after I run it through calculated electrophoresis and look at the electrophoregram, I look at the data and I have to determine, is there enough data to determine the number of contributors? Is this a single source profile? Is this a two-person profile? Or a two-person mixture? Is it three-person? After looking at the results, I deemed that there wasn't enough information to even determine how many number of contributors were in the profile. So I deemed it insufficient or uninterpretable.
So does that mean there wasn't DNA there?
It means that there was DNA, but I was unable to make any sort of comparison.
You mentioned that you have to determine the number of contributors. What would help you determine the number of contributors to a DNA item?
The number of contributors, it's based off of the DNA results. One of the things that I look at is the number of alleles that are present. As I mentioned, we receive half of our DNA from our mother, half from our father. So at a specific location, I would expect to only find a maximum of 2 different alleles per location. So if I'm looking at, let's say, D8, as you had seen, and there was 3 alleles or 3 different peaks present, it's a pretty good indication that it's coming from at least 2 individuals. If I had seen 4 peaks or 4 alleles, maybe 5 alleles, now there's a potential that there's 3 people that could be contributing to this profile. And after I do an overall analysis of the entire electrophoregram, I will then come to a determination of whether it's 2 or 3.
So when you're said overall, do you look at each area or each address that you're looking at individually?
Individually first, and then overall to get the final interpretation.
And is that something you have training and experience in doing?
Yes.
How often do you have to analyze mixtures as part of your DNA casework?
Mixtures usually come up, I would say, at least half of the time in DNA samples that are processed.
Okay. So going on to what was labeled for your DNA report as item number 21. What was that listed as?
It's listed as swab from spent casing Blazer 40 S&W PM number 18.
Were you able to get any DNA results from item number 21?
I was not.
Why not?
There wasn't sufficient DNA present in the extract to obtain DNA results on the electrophotogram after I did the amplification.
Okay, going on to item number 22. What was that described as?
Swab from Gucci sandals, PM number 19.
On number 22, were you able to determine the contributors on that particular swab?
That result was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 contributors.
And were you able to identify the 3 contributors?
I was not.
In terms of, are you able to say and give a statistic as to each of the 3 individuals that you identified on item 22 as to their likelihood of being a contributor to that mixture?
Yes. So every sample that is deemed to be conclusive or whether interpretable single source mixture, I would then do a comparison to any known samples submitted. So each of the 3 individuals were compared against this mixture.
And were you able to determine whether or not you can give support to Christopher Thomas being included in that mixture?
Yes, the DNA results are 4,730 times more likely if they originated from Christopher Thomas and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals. And this provides moderate support that Christopher Thomas is included as a contributor.
So this is the first time, ladies and gentlemen, of the jury have heard moderate support. Can you explain what the verbal qualifiers are that you're going to be testifying and using to describe the DNA results?
Yes, the likelihood ratio can go from really small numbers. The resulting likelihood ratio number can go from really small to really large. So I will have a verbal qualifier listed on the report, and it goes from limited support, moderate support, strong support, and very strong support. And this tries to give a scale to the number that you're hearing.
And so the numbers that you're going to be talking about are exponential at sometimes.
That's correct.
If it's the opposite direction, if it's an exclusion, what type of number, what type of words would you be using?
If it's an exclusion, which is really, there's a chance that there's a small likelihood for exclusion, and at that point there would be limited support for exclusion, or it would just be a straight exclusion with no verbal qualifier.
So going back to item 22, you said moderate support as to Christopher Thomas.
That's correct.
Okay. And did you also analyze that with regards to the individual that was identified as Anthony Williams?
I did, yes.
And so what was the likelihood ratio that Anthony Williams was a contributor to the DNA found on those samples?
The DNA results are at least 3.07 times 10 to the 25th, or 30.7 septillion. Times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
With regards to the individual that was identified as Cortlen Henry, what conclusions were you able to draw with regards to him and that DNA sample?
He was excluded as a contributor.
So you said 30.7 septillion. How many zeros is that?
There are 25 zeros after the 3.
Why is it that you don't say it's Anthony Williams, Chris Thomas, and some unknown individual?
Sometimes that is reported if it's requested. The likelihood ratio that I'm reporting on now is done on an individual basis. So I would conduct or calculate the likelihood ratio of the first individual, report the number, do a likelihood calculation of the second individual, report the number, and if it's requested, an additional calculation can be done and reported in which both individuals would be included in the mixture.
So I want to make sure it's clear. You're looking at each contributor individually,
Yes.
and that is because it's the hypothesis is either however many times more likely that they are versus that they are not included.
Could you say that again?
You're making me do math. So with regards to the likelihood ratio, the first hypothesis is the number that you come out with, or the number you're reporting. If it is the 30.7 septillion times more likely that they are included, that's the first hypothesis, that they are there and they are a contributor. The second hypothesis is that they are not. So you're saying that it is 30.7 septillion times more likely they are a contributor than they are not, than they are excluded.
Sort of. I would explain it as, again, these likelihood ratios are, it's a calculation that's going against two competing hypotheses. So there is more support that Mr. Williams, in this case, would be included, along with two other unrelated individuals, than if the DNA results were coming from three unknown individuals.
Okay. And so for item 22, the swab from the Gucci sample you had testified Cortlen Henry was excluded.
That is correct.
Okay. Moving on to item number 23. What was that?
It's listed as a cutting blood stain on front of T-shirt. Drew, I'm not sure how to say this, Drew Philmedit C G10.
Okay, going on to item number 23, the cutting from the front of the T-shirt. What were your results on that?
The DNA results were interpreted as a mixture originating from two contributors.
Okay.
After doing the comparisons to each individual, the DNA results are at least 982 times more likely if they originated from Christopher Thomas and one unrelated unknown individual than if they originated from two unrelated individuals. And this provides moderate support that Mr. Thomas is included as a contributor.
And then with regards to Anthony Williams.
The DNA results are 3.22 times 10 to the 25th, or 32.2 septillion. Times more likely if they originated from Mr. Williams and one unrelated unknown individual than if they originated from two unrelated individuals. And this provides a very strong support that Mr. Williams is included as a contributor.
982 and 32.2 septillion. That's a big difference.
Yes, and that's, again, one of the reasons that the verbal qualifier is put into the report.
In terms of identifying and making a conclusion based on that, is there anything that you take into account as to the amount of DNA that's in it?
The DNA mixtures that are analyzed at the laboratory that I analyzed, I use a program called StarMix, or STRMix, and this is a program that helps to deconvolute these mixtures. And what deconvolute means is to determine if you have two contributors in the mixture, are you able to tease out or generate essentially who the first contributor would be compared to who the second contributor would be. As the amount of DNA is increased, in these DNA extracts and these amplification products, the result becomes more robust, and you would have a more solid comparison, or an easier comparison, maybe that might be the right word. If you have a full single source DNA profile, it's a lot easier to compare to a standard than if you had a really partial DNA profile. And once you start compounding that into a mixture, if you have essentially two partial DNA profiles mixing into one stain, which would then make this partial two-person mixture, doing comparisons may lead to likelihood ratios that are on the lower side, versus if you had two robust DNA profiles, or two robust DNA sources of DNA making a mixture, and then the likelihood ratios may result in a number that's far larger and more support for the inclusion.
Okay, so I want to make sure it's clear. If you have 1 gallon of blood from one individual and 1 drop of blood from another individual, is that still, you can get out 2 profiles?
There is a potential to this, but again, it depends on the overall result.
Would that come across in the data that you're looking at?
Absolutely.
And how would that read out in the data?
When I look at a DNA profile, mixture profile, you can see, or oftentimes you can see that there is one contributor that is contributing or providing more genetic material to the mixture versus the second contributor or third contributor. So you'll see differences in the peak heights or the alleles or the characteristics as you go across the electroparagram. And I can look and see, hey, this looks like a 2-person mixture. This one contributor is providing more DNA material than this other contributor.
As to item number 23, can you say which individual contributed more genetic material to that cutting on the front of the t-shirt Drew filmed it?
I cannot specifically say that, but the likelihood ratio would provide the verbal qualifier that there's very strong support that Mr. Williams was included as the issue, or actually the issue.
So going, and then in terms of, did you also analyze that cutting against Cortlen Henry?
I did. Mr. Henry was excluded as a contributor.
So I want to also take a moment here to talk about different types of DNA and serology. Did you do serology on this particular item, item 23?
I did, yes. I did a presumptive test for the indications of blood, and it was positive.
If there are blood genetic material and epithelial genetic material, does that change your analysis in any way? Do you know they're commingled?
No.
And why not?
If a stain has potential blood on it, I'm going to take a cutting or a sampling based off of that size of that blood stain, because I can't saturate my DNA extract with all the blood DNA or DNA from the blood stain in hopes that I obtain enough, or there is any second contributor from any potential epithelial cells. And epithelial cells are basically the skin cells on the outside surfaces of your body. So if I were to rub this bench top here, deposit some of my DNA from my skin cells from my hand, and then there's a blood stain that comes up next to it. If the investigator swabs this, essentially this mixture of my DNA plus the blood stain, the blood is going to, for the most part, cover up or provide a majority of that DNA, because the blood is a far richer source of DNA than the skin cells.
Is a person's DNA the same in every cell in their body?
It is.
So going on to now item number 23. What is that described as? I'm sorry, 24. We just finished 23. Item 24. What is that described as?
The cutting blood stain on rear of t-shirts, Drew Phillips, CG10.
Did you do a DNA analysis on item number 24?
I did. It was interpreted as originating from a single male contributor.
And were you able to make a reasonable or a likelihood ratio as to which individual contributed to that blood stain?
I did the comparisons to the 3 individuals. The DNA results are at least 1.59 times 10 to the 25th, or 15.9 septillion times more likely if they originated from Mr. Thomas, Christopher Thomas, than if they originated from one unrelated, unknown individual.
Were you able
Mr. Henry and Mr. Williams were excluded as contributors.
That's my next question. So with regards to item number 25, were you able to conduct a DNA analysis of that item?
I did.
What was that item identified to you as?
Swab, bloodstain, G12, Air Jordan, sneaker E.
Were you able to come to a conclusion as to the source of that bloodstain?
I obtained a DNA profile and interpreted it as originating from a single male contributor. Mr. Williams, or all 3 individuals were compared. The comparisons of Mr. Anthony Williams. The results are at least 5.3 times 10 to the 25th, or 53 septillion, times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams than if they originated from one unrelated, unknown individual. Mr. Henry and Mr. Thomas were excluded as contributors.
So I want to move on to the next report that you did. In terms of the crime lab and how it works, when evidence is submitted to the lab, is it submitted in batches from the investigative agencies?
When evidence is submitted, we have a submission policy. So based off of the type of incident that's being investigated, there's essentially a number of items that can be submitted. In the cases of homicides, there are typically 10 to 12 items per testing round, is what we call it. We want the investigators to provide the most probative evidence for their investigation first, and then move on after that. With the cases of maybe a non-suspect burglary case, you may only get 2 evidence items worth.
In terms of limits on homicide cases, is there any limit to the number of items that can be worked?
There's no limit as far as I know. Again, it's worked in a series of samples so that 100 or 150 items aren't submitted all at once. Again, to try and have the investigator determine which would be the most probative evidence for the investigation.
And in terms of your role in that process, do you know the underlying facts of the investigation as it's progressing?
Sometimes yes, but mostly no. I'm typically just assigned the case. There may be some communications between the unit supervisor and the investigator as to why more evidence is being submitted, or reasons why the investigator is requesting more evidence.
Okay. In front of you, there's a stack of items that have already been admitted into evidence. If I may approach, Your Honor.
Yes.
We've talked about a few already here. Do you recognize the green sticker on this item that's already been admitted as State 58? Please.
Yes.
And how do you recognize that?
On the back, it has my laboratory number, my initials, and all the item numbers as they were submitted to the laboratory.
And do you then assign the individual numbers that we talked about?
Yes, the numbers are assigned based off our record-keeping system. They're a sequential number, so the first item gets number 1, and then sequentially down the line.
Okay. Moving on to what's been placed into evidence as State 53. Again, do you recognize that item?
I do. Again, it has my laboratory number, my initials, and my item numbers marked on it.
What's been previously admitted into evidence as State 33. Do you recognize that item?
I do. Again, it has all my markings on it.
Okay. As to what has been admitted as State 46.
Yes, again, the items are marked and my notations are on the evidence.
Okay. And as to item States 32, did you ever get this one?
I don't think so.
So the answer is no.
No, I do not, because my markings are not on here.
Okay. As to what's been admitted as State 26, have you reviewed that item?
Yes, I have.
Is that
I've
okay?
marked it and with my laboratory item numbers and my initials.
So I'm approaching with what's been previously marked as State GG for identification purposes only. Okay, I'm showing you what's been previously marked as States GG for identification purposes only. Do you recognize that item? Please. It is open.
Yes, it has my markings on it, case number, item numbers, initials.
Did you analyze the items inside of that package?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Hold on just a moment. So showing defense counsel, it's been marked as State triple T. Correct. Showing you what's been marked as State triple T for identification purposes only. Do you recognize that item?
I do. It again has my information marked on the outside.
And did you collect that item?
No, I did not collect it.
Is that an item that you analyzed?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll come back to that. Thank you so much. So all of the items that we're looking at here, Mr. Rhodes, are packaged in paper bags.
4 manila envelopes, yes.
Why is that?
The investigators use these types of evidence packaging in case the evidence is wet. It helps to allow air to get through the package to dry it. One of the things that will cause issues, degradation, is essentially having a biological stain remain wet, and mold, mildew, and bacteria will grow on it and potentially destroy any DNA that's present.
Is it important to keep DNA in a dry environment for preserving it?
Yes.
Is there limits on the temperature range in which the DNA is kept at the evidence vault?
There's no limits. The evidence vaults in laboratories are around 60 degrees, maybe 65. We do have freezers that we have old cases. So as long as the evidence is kept cool and dry, and being frozen is cool and dry, the DNA will persist for decades.
In terms of if the DNA is heated, would that cause degradation to it?
Yes, heat, moisture, and sunlight are three of the main factors that will cause degradation and essentially destruction of the DNA present.
So why don't they just keep it in plastic bags?
The plastic won't allow any air to get through to the evidence, and it will basically cause condensation if it's moist. If the evidence is moist or wet, which will then lead to the mold, mildew, and bacteria growing.
Can one person's DNA change to become someone else's?
No.
How does it not? Does air bring other DNA into those bags and samples?
No.
So going back now on to item number 26 that you processed. What was that identified as to you?
Swab from Yellow Jacket.
And there's another number that you list in your notes and reports of an 81. Where is that number coming from?
The first number, 26, is the item number that is generated in the laboratory when I am doing inventory in my inventory system. The 81 is the agency number as it's submitted on the property receipt.
Okay. So going on to Item number 26. Did you analyze the swab of the yellow jacket as it's described?
I did, yes.
And what were your conclusions on that particular item?
The results were interpreted as a mixture originating from 4 contributors.
So were you able to make determinations as to the standards that you had?
I did, yes.
Okay, we could discuss first with regards to Anthony Williams. What conclusion did you reach and what statistical basis for that?
He was included as a contributor to the mixture. In the likelihood calculation, the results are at least 2.05 times 10 to the 8th, or 205 million. Times more likely if these DNA results originated from Anthony Williams and 3 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 4 unrelated unknown individuals.
In terms of a 4-person mixture, do you expect the statistics to be a little bit lower, just based on that?
It depends on, again, when I was speaking of contribution, if a person is more represented in a sample, the statistics or likelihood calculation can be rather large. It just depends on how much contribution is in that mixture.
Were you able to exclude anybody from the swab of the yellow jacket, item 26?
Christopher Thomas and Cortlen Henry were excluded.
In terms of item number 27, how was that item, I'm sorry, yes, item number 27, how was that number identified to you?
Swab from Gatorade bottle.
Were you able to analyze that and develop DNA profiles?
I obtained a single source profile indicating male origin.
Were you able to determine the single source origin of that profile?
Christopher Thomas was included. The likelihood calculation is as follows. The DNA results are at least 1.65 times 10 to the 25th, or 16.5 septillion. Times more likely if they originated from Mr. Thomas than if they originated from 1 unrelated unknown individual.
Okay. Going on to item number 28, did you do the same?
I did.
And what was that listed as?
Swab from Gatorade bottle.
And that swab, who were you able to determine, or what DNA conclusions were you able to make?
The DNA results were interpreted as originated from a single male contributor. Mr. Anthony Williams was included. The likelihood calculation, the DNA results are at least 4.38 times 10 to the 25th, or 43.8 septillion times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams than if they originated from 1 unrelated unknown individual.
At this point in everything that we have talked about, were you provided a standard for the defendant, Jamell Demons?
No.
So going on to item number 29, were you able to develop a DNA profile on that particular item?
I analyzed the results and deemed it to be uninterpretable due to limited data.
And what was item number 29?
It's listed as swab from bloodstain on rear passenger seat, PM number 1.
And you couldn't say where that was collected from.
I can.
Going on to your next report, I'm going to talk about the MVAC filter. Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what is an MVAC filter?
An MVAC filter is a filter paper where the investigator will essentially soak the surface of whatever they're looking for, maybe a shirt or a shoe or even a door, in a liquid, and they come back and they vacuum it up. And all of that vacuumed up liquid will then go and be deposited on the filter paper. That filter paper is then taken out of the apparatus, dried, and then I will take a portion of that filter paper and try and develop a DNA profile from the surface that they process.
Excuse me, I didn't hear the item number. What's that?
It's item number 31 of his report.
Thank you.
So on the MVAC filter, item 31, that you were asked to process in this case, what was your information relayed as to where that MVAC source was?
It's identified as MVAC filter 9 from spent casings found on ground at US 27 and Southwest 208th Avenue.
So we talked a little bit about things that are conducive to DNA. Does sunlight have an effect on it, you said, I believe, right?
Yes, it can.
What does sunlight do to DNA if exposed?
Again, with the heat, light, and moisture, it allows bacteria to grow and to essentially degrade the DNA.
And when you did an analysis of item number 31, the MVAC filter, what conclusions were you able to draw?
I did an extraction on the piece of evidence, and after quantitation, I determined that there was insufficient amount of extracted DNA to go forward. So I did not attempt to develop a DNA profile, and I stopped processing at that point.
And if you remind ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what does it mean if you stop it at that second step?
The extraction, meaning I would not obtain a DNA profile that could be used for any sort of comparisons. There just isn't enough genetic material in the extract.
What is the information, what are you relying on, and what training and experience to make that conclusion?
It's the quantitation results, the type of samples that I have obtained or that I analyzed. So I'm not surprised that MVACs from casings yield very little DNA.
Moving on to your next report, item 32. Was that item provided to you for DNA analysis?
It was, yes.
And that is in evidence, I believe, if I may, as states 46.
Yes.
Okay, so if I may, published for the jury. So I'm publishing now states 46. What was states 46 reported to you to be?
These are oral swabs or standards from Jamell Demons.
And with regards to item number 32 and 33 in your report, are they the same?
Item number 32 is listed as the right cheek, and 33 is listed as the left cheek.
Similar to we previously talked about, did you just pick one to test?
Correct, I did just the first one.
Is there any rhyme or reason as to picking the right versus the left?
Nope.
Going on, and so once you got this standard, did you go back and look at the other evidence you previously analyzed?
Yes, so comparisons were made to all the previously analyzed questioned evidence.
So going to item number 22, the swab from the Gucci sandals. Were you able to compare the profile from Mr. Demons as opposed to the profile developed from those sandals?
I did, and he was excluded.
The blood stain on the front of the t-shirt, item number 23. Were you able to compare Mr. Demons' profile to that?
I did a comparison, and he was again excluded.
What about item number 24, the cutting on the blood stain of the rear of the t-shirt?
After comparisons were done, he was excluded.
Okay, then on item number 25, the swab of the blood stain from the Air Jordans.
Again, an exclusion.
Going on to item number 26, the swab from the yellow jacket.
An exclusion as well.
And in terms of the item number 27 and 28, the swabs of the Gatorade bottles. What were the results on that?
Those were both exclusions.
So going forward to what's been shown to you but not yet admitted into evidence for identification purposes is states triple T. What was that item told to you to be?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. On your item 34, what's been shown to you for identification purposes only as states triple T. What was that item described to you to be?
It's listed as a cutting of headliner.
And how did you analyze that particular piece of evidence?
That evidence, I had to do a visual examination on it and actually take a cutting of a potential blood stain.
And can you explain to ladies and gentlemen of the jury what's the difference between using it from a swab versus a cutting of an item?
This was a piece of evidence, a headliner. It was the size, maybe a foot squared. There were some small red brown stains on there. So there's oftentimes where the evidence itself is better to be submitted as opposed to moistening a cotton tip swab and then swabbing it, just in case the small blood stain becomes too diffuse on the cotton tip swab. And why that's important is I do my best to preserve evidence for future testing. So if an item of evidence is submitted, I typically process only half of the evidence. If there's only one swab submitted, I'll process half of the swab, leaving half for retesting either in current technologies by another laboratory or save it for future testing when technology has advanced even further. So if there's small potential blood stains, again, it might be beneficial to actually examine the evidence and take a cutting, as I did in this particular case.
Okay, and in terms of were you able to do an analysis and develop a profile on that particular item?
I did. I obtained a DNA profile originating from a single male contributor.
And were you able to identify the source of that single male contributor?
Mr. Anthony Williams was included as a contributor.
And what support can you assign to him being the contributor?
The likelihood ratio calculation, the results are 5.12 times 10 to the 25th, or 51.2 septillion times more likely if it originated from Mr. Williams than if it originated from one unrelated unknown individual.
Did you also do serology on that specific item?
I did. I did presumptive testing for blood, and it was positive.
When you're doing DNA testing on this, will you know without doing serology if something is epithelial or blood?
I would have.
In this case, the serology indicated blood. And which test did you use to determine that?
I used a phenolphthalein test.
And were any individuals excluded from that sample?
Mr. Henry, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Demons were excluded as contributors.
So moving on to item number 40. We're getting towards the end. With regards to item number 40, was that item submitted and analysis done?
Yes.
Okay. What was item number 40? What steps of the DNA process did you take it through as well?
Item number 40 was extracted for DNA, but after quantitation, there wasn't a sufficient amount of DNA to move forward, and so I did not attempt to do any DNA profiling.
And what was item number 40 described as?
A contact swab of non-blood area of rear updrager seat.
And is this the same discussion we had with regards to the last item? With not enough DNA, so then you stop it at that first step?
Correct, after extraction. Sure, after quantitation.
Why don't you at least try and take it through and go through all the steps?
There oftentimes the quantitation results in a 0, meaning none was detected. Sometimes it results in a null value, meaning not even less than 0 was obtained. So at that point, I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to obtain a DNA profile.
Do you do a control swab or sample as you're going through the DNA process each time?
The DNA processing has several controls during extraction. I have a reagent blank, and this is just a sample of just the reagents by themselves. The extraction reagents that I use will be processed with the samples to ensure that the reagents are free of contaminants. When I do a amplification for PCR, there will be a positive control and a negative control. The negative control is again just a tube of reagents. There shouldn't be any DNA present at the end. And the positive control is a known DNA standard And so after I do my amplification, the negative control needs to be blank, and the positive control needs to generate, or I need to generate the DNA profile from that positive control.
So let's go back. You mentioned reagents. I don't think we've defined that for the jury here today. What is a reagent?
Reagents are the chemicals that I use for my DNA processing.
Are they standard and part of the kit that you were talking about earlier?
There are different components in the amplification kit, quantitation kit. We have different reagents used for extraction. So at every step there are a set of reagents that we use.
And those are all related to the controls as well.
Correct.
So going back, so once we talked about that, let's talk about item number 41. What was item 41 described to you as?
It's listed as blood swab smear from rear of driver's seat.
Were you able to come to any sort of conclusion as to item 41?
I obtained some results, but I reported that they were uninterpretable due to limited data.
What does that mean?
Meaning I obtained the electrocardiogram stage, I've analyzed the ending result of that PCR amplification and deemed that there wasn't sufficient amount of DNA to make any comparisons.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to item number 66. Did you analyze that particular item? And in terms of what was item number 66?
Item number 66 was initially reported as contact swab of rear of driver's side door handle interior.
Were you able to determine what the packaging of item number 66 said?
Yes, the contact swab of rear of driver's side door handle interior.
I'm sorry, on number 66 is which?
Front of driver's side door handle.
So you can't testify as to which it came from.
I'm not sure of the question.
You didn't collect this item of evidence.
No, I didn't.
So after reviewing the item analysis, did you amend your report to read contact swab of front driver's side door handle interior?
That's right.
So going on to item number 42, which is been labeled as item 66 by the Miramar Police Department. What results did you have?
Again, I obtained a DNA profile, but ruled it or determined it to be uninterpretable due to limited data.
Does uninterpretable mean no DNA?
In this case, no, there was DNA present, but it was insufficient amount to make any sort of determination. Number of contributors or even comparisons.
Are you still looking back at those same standards that we've talked about previously?
The interpretation of the question samples is done prior to looking at the interpretation of the notes.
Why is that?
It's to avoid any sort of bias. I want to make my interpretation calls of those unknowns absent of knowing what the known standards are.
Does the computer do any of this analysis or say, hey, it's person A or person B for you?
No, it does not.
So moving on to item number 43. Is that the last item you tested in this case?
Yes.
So with regards to what was item number 43 listed as?
Swab, rear driver's side door handle interior.
Were you able to do DNA testing on that particular item?
I did. Yes.
Did you develop a profile?
I did.
And can you explain what DNA profile you developed?
In this particular case, I reported out both a 2-person mixture and a 3-person mixture.
And so explain why you would report out 2 different hypotheses.
When I did the initial interpretation of the question sample of this item 43, there was the appearance of a 2-person mixture. After doing a comparison to the known standards, And doing the likelihood calculation, the result was essentially unintuitive. There was a lot of contribution being attributed to an individual, but then resulted in an exclusionary likelihood ratio.
So can you explain what that means in a little bit simpler math terms, if possible?
Yeah, essentially the likelihood ratio resulted in exclusion. So after talking with my technical leader, I determined, or we both came to the consensus that it would be best to report out or then interpret it as a 3-person mixture and then report out both results.
So with regards to when you're saying it's an exclusion, is there a certain number of loci that it has to not match for you to report it as an exclusion?
When it comes to likelihood ratios, as I have mentioned before, it's doing it's comparing two hypotheses, essentially that a person is included versus a person, an unrelated unknown individual is included. And it does this at every specific location. So going through all of those locations, there's the potential to have 16, 17, 18 locus-specific likelihoods, likelihood ratios. And at the end of it, those are all multiplied together to get the final result. So if one specific location results in a 0 likelihood ratio, but everything else is inclusionary, it's an indication that there's an issue with how the software was set up. And so as an analyst, I would go back and see what the issue was and then rerun this deconvolution and redo the calculations. In this particular case, after doing a visual comparison of the standards to the mixture and then looking at the resulting likelihood ratios, again, I spoke with the technical leader and we determined that there will be best to report out both.
So I'm going to go starting with the alternative proposition on that. Were you able to exclude anyone in the alternative proposition that you put forth?
Mr. Cortlen Henry was excluded.
With regards to the initial proposition,
Cortlen Henry, Anthony Williams, and Jamell Demons were excluded.
who was included on the initial proposition?
Christopher Thomas was included.
When you were looking at it as 2 contributors, how did you exclude the defendant, in this case, Mr. Demons?
How did I exclude him?
Yes.
So again, after doing the visual comparison and then running it through to generate the likelihood ratio, it resulted in an exclusionary likelihood ratio.
When you looked at it again as a 3-person mixture, were you able to make a determination as to whether or not Christopher Thomas was included as a source of that mixture?
Yeah, he was included as a 3-person as well.
And what were the statistics on the 3-person mixture for Christopher Thomas?
The results are at least 8.15 times 10 to the 24th, or 8.15 septillion times more likely if they originated from Christopher Thomas and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
In terms of, as to Cortlen Henry, were you able to do the statistical calculations as to whether or not he was excluded on a 3-person mixture on item number 43, swab of rear driver's side door handle interior?
Yes, the results are at most 46, and this is an inverse LR calculation because the number was less than 1. So the DNA results are at most 46 times more likely if it originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals than if it originated from Cortlen Henry and 2 unrelated unknown individuals.
So is your conclusion that Mr. Henry is excluded from that sample?
Yes.
Okay. Going on to Anthony Williams, were you able to make a conclusion as to whether or not he was included or excluded?
I did. He was included. The LR calculation, the DNA results are at least 41.2 times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
And in terms of the verbal qualifier that you would give for Mr. Williams being included in that sample, what verbal qualifier would you give?
Limited support for inclusion.
Is that the lowest for inclusion?
Yes.
Okay. I believe I forgot to ask you with Christopher Thomas, what verbal qualifier would you give if he is included on that?
It is the highest at very strong support.
And at last but not least, were you able to analyze the profile of the defendant, Jamell Demons, in this case?
I did this.
And what was your conclusion in a 3-person mixture as to the results of Mr. Demons being included or excluded?
He was included. The likelihood calculation, the DNA results are at least 2.12 times 10 to the 8th, or 212 million times more likely if they originated from Jamell Demons and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
And what verbal qualifier did you give to that particular item of
Very-
Mr. Demons being included?
There is very strong support for the inclusion.
Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
May I?
If you're ready, you may proceed. Sure. We'll take a short recess. Do not discuss the case. Don't form any opinion about the case. Don't allow anyone to discuss the case in the presence. Serving no research. Just leave your notepads on the chair. You let the order reflect the jury stepped out. Counsel Miramar was defendant. Mr. Demons, in your restroom break?
Yes, sir.
Yes, can you arrange that? Thank you. We're on recess.
Jury entering.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please be seated. Let the record once again reflect the presence of the defendant, Demons, his counsel, and assistant state attorneys. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, witness remains on the stand. Counsel, this is your opportunity for cross-examination. If you're ready, you may proceed.
Thank you. I'm going to say good evening to you.
Yes,
Because I feel like it's nighttime.
By any chance, do you know George Bellow?
he is the unit supervisor for the firearms section.
Yeah. He gave us an education on firearms, and you've now given us an education on DNA. So he said he would give us some type of certificate. So I expect you also to get some type of certificate on DNA. But in any event, when did you perform your first DNA testing? The date, please.
May I refer to my notes?
Absolutely. Feel free at any time.
My initial examination of the first evidence was on January 23 of 2019.
2019.
Correct.
And that's when you analyzed or examined various items that came out of a grade G. That was water bottle, some sneakers, I think, a yellow jacket, a Gatorade bottle, item 27, I think you identified.
For this particular date, it was items 16 through 25.
16 through 25, okay. On 123 of 19, you examined a water bottle, a spent casing, Gucci sandals, and a blood stain on front of a t-shirt and a blood stain on the rear of the t-shirt. And also a blood stain on an Air Jordan sneaker, correct?
That's correct.
That turned out not to come back to this young man right over here, correct? Mr. Demons. I'm going to call him Jamell. It's easier. Okay. Is that correct?
At this time or later? 'Cause
Later.
Later. May I refer to my report?
Absolutely. And give us a date that you did that,
Absolutely.
please.
So on January 25th of 2022 is when the comparisons were made to Mr. Demons, and he was excluded from all those items.
That was January of what?
The report was issued on January 25th of 2022.
I'm sorry.
I did my analysis on January 24th, the day before.
Okay. That was approximately 3 years after he was arrested. Did you know that?
I did not.
Then you analyzed, did you not, item 26, a yellow jacket, a Gatorade bottle, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And what date did you examine those items?
That was on August 24th of 2021.
August 24th, you said?
Correct.
Of 21. That was 2 years approximately after he was arrested. Did you know that?
I did not.
And those came from inside the Jeep. Did you know that?
I did not.
And those did not match Jamell, correct?
That's correct. He was excluded.
Then you received some additional items, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What was the date that you received the additional items?
They were received on multiple days.
Okay, give us the first date you received additional items, please.
I began processing the impact filter on January 5th of 2022.
That was approximately 3 years after his arrest.
The cutting of the headliner, which is item 34,
When did you receive that?
was began processing on January 28th of 2022.
Okay. Also about 3 years after his arrest.
Objection, counsel's testifying.
I thought it was a question. Restate it. Sustain. Restate your question.
Did you know it was approximately 3 years after he was arrested?
I did not. Additional items were submitted. These were items 40, 41, and 42. Those were processed on April 25th of 2023.
April 25th of 23?
That's correct.
Did you know that was after we started this
Objection,
trial?
Your Honor, improper.
Excuse me. Why don't you come sidewalk?
Sir, did you know that when you received the blood stain on the headliner, that was after this trial started?
I did not know.
But you started that in April 25th of 23? Just 2 months ago?
The headliner was, that was prior.
Oh, I'm sorry. The item that you received on April of 23 was what?
Those were the contact swab, non-blood area rear driver's seat, the blood swab of smear from rear of driver's seat, and the contact swab of front of driver side door handle interior.
Okay. And you did not know that was after this trial started, correct?
I did not know.
And none of that came back to the DNA of this young man, Jamell, correct?
Correct. It was deemed uninterpretable, as well as one of the items I did not attempt to generate a DNA profile because there was insufficient amount of DNA.
Do you know what the delay was in sending that evidence to you?
Objection, outside the scope, speculation.
And did you receive any other items in 2023?
Yes, one last item, item 43.
And that was the door handle of the rear door? Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
And did I hear you correctly that you first ran a test and it did not come back matching or belonging to or contributor to Jamell?
That's right.
And did I also hear you correctly then you discussed something about your software with your supervisor?
With the technical leader, yes.
And then ran another test and had a 3-person contributor?
That's right. Yes.
And all of a sudden it matched or it was labeled as Jamell may have been a contributor?
That's correct.
What date was that, sir?
That was on June 1st, 2023.
Approximately 3 weeks ago?
That's correct.
Who requested that,
Objection, Your
if you
Honor.
know?
What's the objection?
Speculation, outside the scope.
Well, as far as outside the scope, so overruled. If he knows, he can answer.
Who submitted that item to you 3 weeks ago?
It would have been Miramar, the investigators.
Miramar Police Department?
Yes, I can look at my
Feel
submission
free.
report. It was submitted by a Miramar investigator. Mark Moretti.
Moretti.
Who is listed on the submission form.
And that was the only item that supposedly matched Jamell's DNA, correct?
I believe so. I can look back just to confirm it,
Please do.
but I do believe that is an accurate assessment. Yes, there was an item with the inclusionary likelihood issue.
Could you tell these folks when that DNA was placed on, supposedly, on the door handle?
No, no.
It could have been placed a week.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
How long can the DNA stay on an item?
The DNA can persist on items. Again, as I mentioned, heat, light, moisture can cause it to degrade or become unusable. But if DNA is deposited on a surface, they can last weeks, months, years, if kept in a nice, cool, dry environment.
Did you know this Jeep was stored in police custody in a safe, dry area?
I do not.
May I have one other question? One other moment, excuse me. Thank you very much.
Attorney Redirection.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Rhodes, is it unusual to receive multiple submissions over the life of a case?
No, it's not unusual.
Does the date in which you work a particular item have any effect on the results you report on?
No, it is not.
As to the likelihood ratio on item number 43, who was included in that particular item?
For both propositions, Mr. Thomas was included for both the two-person and three-person contributor propositions. Under the two-person proposition, Mr. Henry, Mr. Williams, and Mr. Demons were excluded. Under the three-person proposition, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Williams, and Mr. Demons were included.
And with regards to the time of collection of that swab, would that be indicated on the box that it is found in?
Sometimes there are indications on the collection. I can look at the marker receipt. They may, I'm not sure if it's a newer one or an older one, but I can look at the marker receipt if you'd like.
Okay, and that would be item number 67, what's been put into evidence as states 33. Latest or not?
Yeah, thanks.
And so item 33 in evidence, is that item number 67 and you're labeling here?
Yes, that's right.
What was the date and time of collection according to that specific item?
So it's dated at 10/26 of 2018,
And the time?
1736.
Okay. If DNA is stored in an optical environment, will it persist forever?
I'm not sure about forever, but it will persist for decades.
And in terms of if it is collected on a cotton swab that is dry and sterile, is that an ideal place to perpetuate DNA storage?
Yes.
Nothing further.
I have one or two questions based on that, if the court will allow me.
Sure, go ahead, sir.
You indicated it's not unusual to get multiple submissions of evidence.
That's right.
Do you know why it took 5 years to submit that exhibit to you to analyze?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
He knows he can answer, do you know?
I do not.
Thank you.
Counsel, is there anything else to this witness?
No.
Is he excused?
Yes, right.
Thank you, Ms. Step Counsel, you're excused. Ladies and gentlemen, my understanding is that's all the witnesses we have for today, and so we'll see everybody back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Remember the admonition, do not discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in the presence of certainly no research, just leave your notepads on your chairs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you, sir. You're excused. Anything to discuss, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to do a sidebar. My computer boot up.
Sidebar?
Yes.
The jury counsel.
Are you, because of the cameras, I think it would be prudent.
That's fine. No, sidebar.
Thank you.
Tomorrow, when can I expect these?
They are digital. I think they'll probably take until at least Monday. Because if you want them in hard copy, they are, I think I'm conservative in saying, 400 pages.
Thank you.
Now, so it's clear, it's not 400 pages like a deposition transcript. It is 400 pages, and it's going to be more like look like a cell phone. And there might be 5 or 6 messages per page. So while it sounds very voluminous in number, it's not as bad as 400 pages would sound normally.
And this is what you shared with defense counsel.
Yes, they have the copies as well.
Thank you.
Digital.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.